So we're jumping into chapter 32 this week, and we are catching up with Jacob on his way home. We know that he had been told by God to head back to Bethel, that first place he encountered with God, and so he's headed there. But there's lots of things waiting for him there. This is the land where his family is. This is the land that God had promised. And when he left the last time, it was in haste and not in the greatest of manner. And so he's on his way back. And the angels of God reveal themselves to him. And he says, hey, there's two camps. And it's almost this realization like, hey, the whole time there was a spiritual realm all around me of things that were here to protect me, angels that were here to help me and protect me. And I wasn't realizing. And he says there was two camps. And so we see he's encouraged to know that God is with him on this journey. But then he says, hey, send my servants out to my brother Esau, tell him I'm coming. And he says it humbly. He says, say to my Lord Esau. So you see that he has this attitude. He knows he needs to come in the right manner. And so he sends them, but his servants come back and they said, we spoke to Esau, now he's coming back with 400 men. And what happens? He gets afraid. He is fearful. It says in verse 7, then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. Why was he distressed? Just a few passages ago, we read how he was with Laban and he was bold and he knew who he was. And he knew what God had promised him. He knew that he was supposed to be getting these things. And now he's afraid. And that's because of his own guilt and shame. He knew he had done his brother wrong. He knew he had deceived his family. He was afraid what was going to happen because of his own guilt. And how many times in our own lives we've done something, we maybe made a mistake, or we've hurt somebody, maybe we've even done it on purpose, and now we have to deal with the consequences, and there's guilt and shame, and we hold back. And you know that guilt always hinders us from what God has for us. Not because he can't reach through that guiltiness of our mistakes, but because we actually draw back and we're like, I'm not deserving, I'm guilty, I'm afraid. And God is sitting there saying, you don't have to be afraid. It's my plan. It has nothing to do with you except for them choosing to use you. And so we see that he starts reverting to fear. And in verse 8, it says, thinking if Esau comes to one group and smites it, and he makes this plan. But what is that word says? It says thinking. It means he reverted to his own wisdom, his own thoughts, when he should have been going to God. And so he finally kind of starts realizing, hey, this is scary. And he prays and he reminds God, you said that I'm supposed to be blessed. You said these things. And so he does the right thing. He prays, he gets a little bit encouraged. And he says, deliver me, I pray. You promised this. And so he has this conversation with God. He prays. But then not much longer, he's there that night. But then guess what? He was maybe rolling in bed, worried, and that fear came back. And so he says, oh no, I have to do something. So he starts sending his servants and his people across to the other side. And it's just him and his wife. Well, then finally he says, you know what, even you have to go. Just go, stay away from me. He wants me. Maybe he'll spare you if you're away. And he's using his own thinking and he's in fear. But this is the greatest place for him to be. Why? Because now it's just him and God. There's no one else around. So he's here. And that night, then God says, oh, I finally have you alone. You can't rely on your servants. You can't rely on your spouses or your children. It's just me and you, buddy. Here we are. And we see that it says that God wrestled with him. The man wrestled with Jacob. But we know that man represents a representation of Christ. It was an appearance of Christ before Christ was Jesus, right? And so we see that it's in essence Jesus wrestling with Jacob, and they're going back and forth, and they're going back and forth. And I think the thing that's interesting to me is Jacob knew that there was something special about this encounter. He was wrestling, but God knew he needed to get that pride out. He needed to get Jacob to realize he needed to lean on him, not on his own strength. And so this was an important point because God had a plan for Jacob to totally change, to be different, to be what he wants him to be. And it was going to take this process. He had to wrestle out the pride of Jacob. And so we see they're going back and forth. And finally, God changed the terms. You see, up to this point, he was allowing him. But at any moment, God can do whatever he wants. He had this plan from before Jacob was even born. He spoke it to Rebekah when she was pregnant, right? So we knew this plan was going to take place. And Jacob seems to think he has some way of changing it or making it happen. And God's sitting here saying, buddy, I can change the terms at any moment. And so in the middle of this wrestling, he hits his hip. And it says he smotes his hip. So he hurts Jacob's hip. And suddenly Jacob's realizing, oh, God changed the terms. I'm nothing. I don't even have the strength to keep up with him, right? And so finally he won't, but he refuses to let go because he says, I know this is God. I know God has something for me. I'm not letting go. And we see that it says, the man asked him, what is your name? And I love this part. It says, in shock of realization, whispering, he said, my name is Jacob, which means supplanter, schemer, trickster, and swindler. And so now he's like, oh my goodness, I'm standing before God. This is God. I'm wrestling with God, and I'm a loser. I've done bad things. I'm terrible. And I have to tell him who I am. I don't deserve to even be touching God. And I love this because he says, no longer will you be Jacob. You won't be that loser anymore. You'll be Israel, which means contender with God, or fights with God. God fights for him. The nice thing about that translation is it can go both ways. We often hear people say it means contender with God, like he contended with God, but most likely it actually means God fights for him. And so I love that idea that God fights for Jacob. God fights for him. He had this plan from the very beginning. And so now he has this limp that is with him for the rest of his life. And I want to read this as we close because I think it's awesome. Now Jacob has to live with this limp, but is that anything compared to knowing that you have wrestled with God and God has a plan for you? And I love what Spurgeon says. He's a theologian. He says the memorial of his weakness was to be with him as long as he lived. We're talking about Jacob's limp. How pleased would you and I be to go halting all our days with such weakness as a hurt hip as Jacob had, if we might also have the blessing that he thus won. So in other words, he was with God and God did this with him, and he won the promise that God had promised to him, and this amazing life and blessing for his family for generations to follow because he contended with God. But he has this limp. And I think sometimes we forget that God has great things for us, but sometimes we might come out limping. Sometimes it might not look like what we thought it would. Sometimes it may not be the dream we thought it was, but God has a plan and he is working it out. And so I encourage you today, you may be in the midst of it saying, I don't know how God's going to work this out. The same as Jacob was at the moment when he said, I don't know how my brother's going to forgive me. But God is there with his host of angels in that other camp, contending for you and me. And so be encouraged today. God has big plans for you, but we have to release. We have to realize that it's his plan and his ways, not our own thinking, not our own fear, and God will take care of the rest. So I encourage you, jump in with us to chapter 33 next week.